Thanks. Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Betsy, and I would love to learn a little bit more about who you all are. Just raise a hands. Who here represents an apparel supplier? No suppliers. How about brands? Okay, nice, awesome. Are you willing to share which brand? I can hear.
Cieli.
Cieli, great. Any other brands? Consultants?
Oh, I'm a consultant.
Me too. I hide it.
Dare you admit what consultant you are?
Hi there, Betsy.
Hi, Karen.
Leadership and sustainability.
Awesome. Any students? I'm guessing no finance folks in the room, but maybe. So what I'm going to be talking about today is the Future Supplier Initiative. It's a program in the apparel industry that finances the decarbonization of apparel suppliers. So our program comes in, identifies what it would take to achieve a science-based target or a Paris-aligned climate goal, and then we finance it. A little bit different than a lot of programs that have been in the apparel industry for a long time. This one is very much focused on achieving an actual science-based target over the period of 2 years, from start to finish, including the necessary incentives for a supplier to be able to do that, which has been a real big gap in our industry for a while. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that program. My background is I've been in the apparel industry for about I'm embarrassed to say 25 years now. And over that time, I've kind of circulated between leading sustainability at brands like Timberland and Patagonia and launching industry-wide efforts aimed at decarbonizing our industry. So things like the Leather Working Group, the Sustainable Apparel Coalition, which is now called Cascal, and the Hague Index. And now this is sort of the latest venture, moving beyond measurement to actually doing the things that we don't need measurement to tell us it needs to be done, the things that physically retrofits the facilities that make our textiles. And so the Future Supplier Initiative is a program of a group of brands and suppliers that are focused on identifying and removing the 3 barriers related to apparel mills achieving science-based targets now. The first is identifying a package of measures, energy efficiency and on-site renewable energies that would lead to not a 10% emission reduction, not a 15% emission reduction, but 50 to 70+% emission reductions on-site in a given factory unit. We're very much focused on apparel mills and dye houses where the large impact lies, especially from the heating of water. The second area that we focus on is once we know what the package of measures are, how can we finance these in a way that gives an apparel supplier real incentive to sign up for physically retrofitting their facilities? And then the last piece is carbon accounting. How can we demonstrate a carbon return on investment for the dollars spent to decarbonize a facility? So we bring those 3 pieces together to generate benefits for both brands and suppliers. And I'll talk a little bit more about the details related to that. Future Supplier Initiative is a membership organization. Brands join it, and they join it to help their suppliers achieve decarbonization targets, not just tell them to set and achieve them on their own. When we pull together our brands, we prioritize their joint supplier list based on a range of criteria, but typically where we've got good overlap, where there's great carbon emission reduction potential, depending on the geography, whether or not there's an opportunity to eliminate coal or do a renewable thermal switch. And from those list of factories, we then go through the stages of developing what a robust set of measures would be at each factory site that's been prioritized to achieve a 50+% emission reduction. And then from there, we provide financing. And I'll go into more details about what the financing looks like, because this is really kind of the innovative crux piece that's been missing to date. In my history of working in industry-wide initiatives, brands typically set a target and expect suppliers to figure out. In this case, brands are coming to the table to de-risk financing so suppliers can get it at an attractive rate to implement these measures. And it's been really cool how we've been able to package that, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. The next bit, of course, is taking that financing, getting the equipment, getting it installed on site, and then lastly, monitoring and reporting on the carbon emissions associated with the projects themselves. So 5 steps. Members join for 2 years. We do all of those stages in the 2-year period. We launched this initiative after pilot testing it with H&M's facilities in India at the Copenhagen Fashion Summit this past May. And right now, this spring, we're moving into our first loan packages for suppliers in Bangladesh and launching programs in Vietnam and India. So for those of you that have production in any of those countries, I would just note, like, those are the geographies we're focused on now. We developed the program specifically for geography, the financing, as well as the technical measures. Why are both brands and suppliers coming to the table for this? For brands that have set science-based targets, I've been in your role at Patagonia when I was trying to figure out how we could halve our emissions beyond a very slim baseline where we're using regenerative organic cotton, responsible wool, responsible down. You listed we were running out of material innovations. Where our only opportunity left was to help textile mills reduce their physical footprint. So that meant thinking about how we are dyeing products and reducing energy waste and sourcing more on-site renewable electricity. That was really the last opportunity. Now my role, where I consult to 30, 40 apparel brands on their climate targets, this is the opportunity for apparel brands and their suppliers to achieve a climate goal. Without this strategy, any 2030 or near-term science-based targets is not achievable. We physically have to retrofit mills to help us achieve these broader global climate goals. And so we do need to get some skin in the game here as brands and recognize that doing this costs money. It costs suppliers money. And them taking on debt, suppliers taking on debt in an environment where there are no sourcing commitments for most brands beyond 3 to 6 months, it's not realistic. So we have to address those real barriers to decarbonize now. And so that's why brands are coming to the table. The brands that have stepped up have recognized there's a cost to decarbonize. It can't be borne just by the suppliers, and they have a role to play in this. And they recognize that this is really the only way they have a fighting chance of achieving their climate goals. And for suppliers, there's a real benefit as well. And the program is designed around creating supplier incentive. And so for suppliers that walk into the room, I'd be really curious to hear if this solves for some of the challenges that you face. So for suppliers that participate in the program, the projects that we identify have a blended payback period of somewhere between 3 to 5 years. That means for the financing portion of this, the cost per ton of carbon comes out to around $10 to $30 per cost per ton of carbon, compared to what we see for external pricing on carbon being $50 to sometimes $100 plus per ton. So competitive carbon return on investment. We're financing $1 to $3 million loans at factories to be able to achieve these aggressive carbon emission reductions at that price. The interest rate that the financing mechanisms provide, somewhere between 1% to 5%. I know 5% sounds high in some cases, for those of us that were used to 2% interest rates not that long ago, but 5% can effectively half the commercial lending rate for interest in some of the countries where we operate. We're seeing 20 to 50 to 75% emission reduction opportunities in the factories where we're financing projects. Cost reductions, although we are still estimating that on the OpEx side. And I think the biggest benefit for suppliers is a commitment. a commitment from brands to be in those factories for longer, because brands have a large role to play in the launching of these financing mechanisms and supporting them through these projects, which I'll chat about in a minute. So I'm going to share a case study. This is a manufacturer who has achieved 24% emission reductions, so getting themselves closer to a science-based target. And the process that we use is to create a technology list for a given country of what are all the possible energy efficiency and renewable energy measures we could implement at an apparel mill. And then we filter those initiatives based on site-specific information. And that filtering of initiatives allows us to evaluate CapEx and OpEx implications and create a blended rate of return that's acceptable to both the brand, who will be doing the investing, as well as the supplier, who will be taking on debt. And you can start to see how this pays back in terms of reduction in electricity, natural gas, and diesel. From this shortlisted set of measures, we build out an investment pro forma to show what investment would be needed. And then our program works with our commercial lending partners and development banks to de-risk the loan to offer competitive interest rates. The way that we offer competitive interest rates is through two de-risking mechanisms. And I always describe this in terms of like house buying, because I'm not a finance person, I'm a sustainability person, and my mind is very simple when it comes to this. So cash collateral, it's like your mom and dad helping you with a down payment on the house. And the guarantee model is where you essentially purchase insurance that the loan will be repaid. In either way, the supplier who's been going through this whole process with us has a package of measures that they're going to implement, and they're going to implement those using the proceeds from a loan that comes from a commercial bank, and they will repay that loan. The interest rate on that loan depends on whether brands who are members of the Future Supplier Initiative either provide cash collateral or purchase a guarantee. So this is the brand commitment, the brand skin in the game that we haven't had to date in the apparel industry for decarbonizing. Brands can either back with cash any losses if the supplier doesn't repay the loan, or they can purchase guarantees from a development bank, which ensures that the supplier repays the loan. And that's what allows them to provide a competitive interest rate to be able to afford measures that ultimately wouldn't get passed through a capital improvement plan or have a business case on its own merit. So the brands involved in this so far in the geography that we're currently launching loans is Bangladesh, and H&M, Bestseller, Mango, and Gap are participating in it. We continue to expand both brands and geographies. And so on the brand side, the way the process typically works, if you're interested in evaluating this program and whether or not it could be utilized to decarbonize your strategic suppliers, is that we start the conversation with Treasury and Finance. So again, unlike other apparel sustainability efforts, this one's a little bit different in that we actually speak with the Treasury teams on this. We get them engaged, help them understand that there's a cost to decarbonize, and that this is a mechanism by which they can support that effort, walk them through the two different financing models, and from there, they determine what they feel most comfortable with from a lending perspective and a risk perspective. After getting that buy-in, then we move towards the actual project stages themselves, the 5 project stages of supplier prioritization to project development to financing and implementation. And on a case-by-case basis, as we go through factory lists, every single brand gets to approve who they invest in and what the investment amount would be. So that's sort of the quick overview of how brands join us. There's also a process for suppliers joining us, and I'd say for those of you that are in Bangladesh, India, or Vietnam, this is currently where the program's operating. We operate in specific geographies because we need specific banking relationships, regulatory approval, carbon accounting methodology approval. And so if any of you are in Bangladesh, India, or Vietnam, and you're a supplier to the brands I've listed or the brands that are joining FSI, understanding where they are with their membership and on their priority list of suppliers, we can have a conversation about your ability to get financing and technical support through this program. That's the quick overview. Charles has told me I have a lot of time to answer questions, which is probably the way to go because this is a financing mechanism, and I typically get a lot of questions about how the nuts and bolts of that work. I'm happy to take that. I'm also happy to talk about the types of projects we're doing too, or answer any other questions.
I think at this stage, can we initially show our thanks to Betsy for what you've just described, and then we'll go into questions and see how it progresses. But if you were listening to that and you're thinking, I don't get this, that's the stage I'm at. It's something very interesting. You're saying the words which make me smile because you're simplifying, you're de-risking, which is of phenomenal interest to me. So what I want to do is I want to entertain some questions. And if you don't ask questions, I'm going to be picky on Betsy herself. Now, there's some wise people in the room. Betsy will also, after the presentation, I'll trap you by the side of the stage in case people want a one-to-one with you. Sure. But initially, are people getting it? Does it make sense? Does anyone want to add anything to the contribution? He says, looking around for questions. Otherwise, those people whose name I know live in fear because I will appear with the microphone. So, Betsy, I'm going to kick off. What I like about this process is that you've taken a longer-term solution to a short-term need. How easy was it to set it up with investors or whoever has come up with the money in the first place? How willing were people to join in as opposed to you having to sell the idea to them? Does that make sense as a question?
Yeah, absolutely. So my first pitch of this was while I was at Patagonia to the CEO at the time. And she actually told me to my face it was the dumbest idea she had ever heard. So that was how I started. No joke. Legit. Dumbest idea. And so it was a rough start.
Would this be a person who's into mushrooms at the moment, should I ask?
I have no idea. I have no idea. And no hard feelings. It was the wrong audience, because, Patagonia, as we know, really works, now officially, as an environmental nonprofit. And this idea where brands lean in and de-risk, there's an opportunity for brands to get their money back out of this, which really dramatically lowers the cost per ton of carbon when you think about decarbonizing a supply chain. And so it wouldn't make sense to that audience, right? So from there, it was a slow uphill battle. We know that we need to have apparel mills decarbonize. We know there's not incentive for apparel mills to do this today. 2030 goals are getting close, and the apparel industry answer to this has largely been circularity, which is not feasible for achieving 2030 climate goals. I'm a climate scientist, just being really realistic. Even with this program, if brands don't start investing in 2026, they're not going to meet their 2030 goals. So for me at Patagonia, I was like, this is very simple math. There's only so much we can do from a materials standpoint. We have to physically change these factories. To do that, we have to create some incentive, and unless brands are willing to step up and say, I'm willing to make long-term sourcing commitments to you, supplier, they're not going to do it because why should they? I mean, you're not going to buy a house and take out a mortgage if you don't know you have a salary next year. So why, how do we think this is going to happen? So you can tell I get very passionate about this, but as somebody that spent so much of my life figuring out, if we measure it, we can solve it. But we're not solving it because we've got some real disincentives to solving it right now that we're not addressing. And I think the sustainability folks get it, but treasury and finance hasn't gotten it. So getting back to the answer to your question, it's been a long slog to bring treasury and finance teams along. And I want to give a major kudos to H&M, whose treasury team dedicated funding to figure this out which is now benefiting other brands that get to come in and leverage these financial mechanisms because their CFO recognized there is a cost to decarbonize, and we have to bear that. We can't just put it on the supplier. Now that we've got a host of brands in, and we have a host of suppliers that have gone through the program and have benefited from these interest rates, we are escalating quite quickly and able to expand geographies. That has taken a lot of relationship work, not just with the brands, but also banks. You know, we have to develop banking partnerships to get competitive rates for the suppliers, and they're having to use their creative juices to figure out how to do something they typically don't do. In the apparel industry, the amount of financing we've had has related to supply chain finance, which is getting factories paid faster than the typical 60 to 90 days. And those programs really only benefit the factories that are able to invest in environmental projects. It doesn't help higher risk suppliers or those that don't have the funding and support to be able to implement environmental measures. So this gap in developing those creative financing mechanisms with not just commercial banks, but the development banks who provide our loan guarantees has been a lot of work, but it's on their end, it's been, I think, the most fun that they've had in their jobs in a while. It's fun for me, too. I didn't know finance could be so creative and interesting, but yeah, so it's, you know, we're just hitting that point right now, Charles. Now brands that come in, they get to benefit from all the work that's been put in by those banks and the first brands to join. And now they actually have case studies where they can say, okay, you know, here are projects that are actually implemented. We can see the carbon emission reductions, we can see the impact on CapEx, OpEx, and we can see the loan repayment. So, and I want to say, like, too, it has been a long slog, but we have partners in this. So this program, Guidehouse, my firm manages. However, the Fashion Pact and the Apparel Impact Institute are partners in leading this program, and they've been very great and gracious about bringing in their memberships and giving access to this mechanism.
Can I just mention the AII? We don't talk about it enough over in Europe. They're up to very interesting things, is all I'm saying. They're one of those things which I'm starting to comprehend how they get bigger. But I'm going to go on a slight diversion to develop this. We were lucky on Tuesday to have a day zero here, where we got a lot of creatives in the room with corporate social responsibility people. And magic happened. We just put them in the room, locked them up. There's a guy called Stuart involved, I believe.
Don't know him.
And the amount of feedback which has come back that CSRs are sick and tired of having to fly the flag so that everything is put on their department, whereas this better practice is something incorporating everyone's attitude within the company. Mm-hmm. You're now giving a channel for finance to be part of the solution,
Yeah.
which in hindsight is just common sense. So when you're going into these companies and you're speaking to them, what is the one thing, how have you changed your message from when you first had it when you were at Patagonia?
Yeah.
What did you not get right in the first place that you found is actually a better channel now?
That's a great question.
Charles doesn't ask easy questions.
No.
I want value for money from you.
Now you're going to find what a cheater I am and how lazy I can be. So I actually have other treasurers present to treasurers now. So I've learned enough big words in finance to be slightly dangerous. My brother and my husband are like reformed CFOs, and they give me kudos that I've learned some big words. But putting those big words together cohesively for CFOs, I don't think I'm nailing it. But who's involved in the membership is, yes, we have sustainability people involved, but it's mainly treasury now. So when I was at SAC, I was managing a group of sustainability geeks. I say that with the utmost compliments. Now I'm managing a group of treasurers, and I'm managing commercial banks in a conversation together. And I found the most successful way to do this is have treasurers talk to other treasurers. And the brands that are involved are the ones that are proclaiming the success of this program, they're able to talk about things that I would never be able to talk about, like how you book these expenses or how they evaluate risk when they're setting money aside for this. So, you know, I know my strengths and I know my weaknesses. I think letting CFOs and treasurers speak to each other has been the best part of it. And it's so cool to see yet another part of our companies engaged in this, taking, like you said, some of the heat off of the CSO's role and putting it where the purse strings lie, which, yeah, you're right. Why didn't we think of that before, right?
I'm going to disrupt the conversation by bringing in a person who's better than me.
Oh,
You know,
go for it.
Charles.
No pressure, Karen.
Betsy, it's lovely to see you again.
Thank you.
I mean, I know you since so many years, and I must say I'm really impressed by your ability to focus on what is really important
Thank you.
and to nail down that the topics that one needs to work on. I have one question. So I think there was on one slide you were showing that, you know, the $1 per ton saved carbon dioxide. And I was asking myself, is this working at the factory level? Or
Yep.
is it working at the factory?
At
so
the,
not
a
at the brand
specific
level.
factory level, and even sometimes within a specific unit within a factory.
Ah, okay.
Yep.
Yeah. And would it be possible for the brands, if they now have a supply chain, to even try to understand which factories would have the biggest potential?
Yeah, that's what we do in that first step of supplier prioritization. So with those 4 brands that started this program at Copenhagen Fashion Summit back in May, we brought their supplier list together just for Bangladesh. And we had 80 suppliers on the table. Of those 80, we ranked them against a set of criteria: supplier overlap, greenhouse gas emission reduction potential, how mature they were at addressing climate. Like, had they been through a program like the Carbon Leadership Program? So like 4 or 5 criteria. And we ranked those factories to see what would make sense to be the first investments. If we had to pick out of the 80, who were the top 30? So we narrowed it down to the top 30. We're not forgetting about the rest of the list. We're just running in waves because we're not going to reach out to 80 suppliers at once. And so of the top 30, we presented the program to them and said, here's indicative interest rates. Here's what the program gets you. Here's what it looks like for the brand who's investing their own money to de-risk the loans. They got to stick with you to get this carbon benefit. And of those 30 suppliers, we said, if you have an interest in moving forward, please sign this letter of intent. You're committed to exploring what the measures would be and having conversations with the bank to look at what a commercial lending package would be. Of those 30, 24 came back within the first week and they were like, absolutely, you know, which is great validation, but there's still more steps. Then we have to identify what are the projects. Maybe the supplier has already identified some, but maybe they haven't thought about a full range of measures, and that's where our technology list comes in. Our technical team of engineers comes in and evaluates technology agnostic, what are all of the tons of CO2 we can eke out of this factory by making equipment upgrades or process upgrades. We pull that into an investment pro forma, and then we present the projects to both the supplier and brand. The supplier doesn't get the very attractive interest rate unless they agree to the full package. And I didn't mention that before, but that's a pretty unique thing about this too. I think there's been a lot of work to identify what are the low-hanging fruit opportunities in a facility? How can you get a 10% emission reduction? And then we kind of like tap out around 10, 15%. Here we say, this is an amazing interest rate, but you are taking on debt. We're only going after this. The brands are only going to invest what could add up to be millions of dollars for a period of 3 years or longer if you do everything. Because this isn't the time to do 10 to 15%. This is the time to do 30%, 50% more. Then, once we get through that in a factory, the opportunity we have after all these on-site measures is, okay, can we procure renewable electricity and go on to higher measures? But like, let's get our sites as efficient as humanly possible before we start going out and sourcing more expensive renewable electricity in some cases. So that's that's how we get at that prioritized list of suppliers, is working with those brands and identifying and doing a whole supplier engagement process to see, is this a right fit or not? This is, in general, what we found is this is a good fit for strategic suppliers for brands. It's not going to service all factories, and there are other great initiatives coming up right now with like IFC and others that are looking at kind of the non-strategic supplier side of things. But for the factories that are driving the majority of your footprint, this program's really designed for that. And those that need the help of getting over that hurdle of 1-2 year payback measures to longer payback measures, 3-5 years on-site renewables.
Thank you.
Thanks, Karen.
Karen, I want to build on that, but I'm looking around for hands for other people to contribute. I know you know about the EOG, who is the biggest influence of this trade, the European Outdoor Group. I am pretty certain, but I don't know, they did a circular with the top 10 biggest brands in Europe to see which of them shared manufacturers. So they asked for their main locations and the factories there. There was one factory that was making for all 10 brands. The average was 7 of the top 10 brands were based in a particular factory. And I think there was only one factory that only did one of the suppliers. Each of those brands, even though if you think of the biggest brands in Europe and America, they were the people polled, every brand had an imposter syndrome. Because although they wanted the factory to move to better practice, because they were just a single voice, they felt they couldn't tip the balance. The EOG has, because it's pre-competitive, broke the barriers. And when suddenly you get 7 brands in a block saying, you will move, otherwise we will leave. And from those top 10 brands, they're all now basking in being able to influence the factories. And I see a lot of correlation with this and what you're doing. They were getting them to think of moving, and you're enabling the finance for them to move. So the question is more, how are we going to roll this out even further? We were lucky that we had the brands working together and they were able to share information. What has been your hindrance of not getting everyone to buy in? Is it at the brand level who are asking for it? Is it trying to get the finance going? Is it the cooperation of the factories? If you had a magic wand, where would you wave it first to make things easier?
So I think number one, and I'm going to just kill my program right up with this. If brands were willing to make longer-term commitments to their suppliers for sourcing, we wouldn't need this program, and we wouldn't need a whole lot of stuff that we throw upon ourselves in this industry to decarbonize. But that's not happening with a lot of brands. The majority of brands I know about, the ones that are driving highest volume in the factories. And I see you nodding, Krishna. Thank you. And so absent of that, we have to create incentives. And what I've found from 25 years of working in the industry is threats about leaving, they don't really solve problems, and their threats, they're not really ever acted upon. And if we need examples of that, we can just look to all the social labor challenges in our industry as like perfect illustration of this. So for me, it's about, okay, how do we create enough incentive? Now, I feel like we're starting to solve for some of the barriers and incentives with this program that I experienced when I was leading sustainability in brands. But we need to make it like too big to fail, in that, you know, those early folks that have put a lot of effort and money into this program are getting supported with other investors, and everybody feels like they can come in and play a part independent of how big their brand is, how much capacity they have in that supplier. And so for me, like that's the next big thing. We've figured out this program with some large brands who have set aside funds to decarbonize their suppliers. They're far and few between. Now we have to think about who are the smaller brands, who are the brands that have less capacity in these factories, how can we give them a part to play? I think the smaller brands, they might be more challenged from a resourcing standpoint in terms of joining industry initiatives and putting people against programs. But what I see them doing is saying, I have limited dollars, but I can put them into a project. And this factory is important to me. I want to be able to create space for them to be able to do that here too. So I think that's kind of where we're pivoting a little bit now, is how do we get some smaller, medium-sized brands in and their suppliers, so we're not just servicing the larger brands who have already established funds for this. So fortunately, because they have done that, now we have that flexibility and ability to be able to do that. So
I'm going to pivot this slightly to make sure the audience is involved. I'm going to come around. Can I just have a show of hands? Before Betsy took the stage, we didn't go into detail about what Betsy was going to talk about. Who feels on a grade you totally get it, you only half get it, so you know it's something interesting but you don't understand it, or keep your hands down if it's not making sense? Can I ask for a show of hands from everyone? Do we totally get it? Are we interested but we still need more? Or keep your hands down? I think you're having a good reaction. Thank you. I'm just going to get a question. Because when Stuart, who educates me about things, tried to explain this, it didn't work on me. But Betsy, you explaining it, it does work. Thank you.
thank you.
Hi, Betsy.
Hi.
Really great to see you after a long time.
So nice to see you.
And I would like to congratulate you first, because this idea, as you said, how it sounded to your previous CEO, and you guys have gone with it. And I would like to give a context to people, because I work for Lenzing. I lead global sustainability for Lenzing, which is an Austrian company known for fibers like Tencel and those. And coming back to brands having skin in the game is the real challenge I do face in my job on a day-to-day basis, right? So what am I saying is that when we talk to brands, most of them ask, are you able to do this cost neutrally? Like cost neutrality is the kind of God, right? And we have the first science-based target, and we have had a roadmap for 2030. And we invested in a natural gas boiler, which costed around 20 million, and a biomass boiler, which cost also 20 million. And we have a program until 2030 for a 200 million. Who is going to pay for it?
Yeah.
Right? That's huge capex.
Yeah.
And that's why I think the program that you are bringing is really promising. Of course, those CFOs and treasury people has to look at the upside of it, because there are some other carbon taxes and risks that are going to come out of it. So huge kudos again.
Thanks.
So it's not easy. It's a great direction. There is only one question I have. So some of the projects that we are dealing with have 5 to 10 years payback periods. Like, do you see this project's potential for investments in the order of 10 to 50 million over a period of 7 to 10 years payback period?
Yeah, absolutely. I think these projects, we've seen projects with the potential to be 14, 15 million, and that's when you're doing large on-site renewables. When we look at thermal electrification, that's also, of course, very expensive. And when you look at some more process-related technologies focused on water efficiency, that also can be more expensive. For this initial group, we've focused very much on how can we optimize and get achievement of a science-based target with commercially proven off-the-shelf technologies, and we blend energy efficiency measures that have a fast payback with longer tail renewable energy measures that have a longer payback. We also have to balance OpEx. You mentioned biomass boilers, and biomass is an important transition fuel in a lot of countries where electrification is not yet appropriate due to grid instability. And as such, we have to factor in changes in OpEx, especially if biomass is more important. So right now, we're really staying in that 3 to 5 year time frame and trying as hard as possible to get it to 3. For adding in other measures that could have other positive environmental and social impacts, we will start to see longer payback periods, and that's where kind of testing this project with the development banks to see if they can take on the guarantees and the risks after brands do it in the first few years, I think is our best opportunity to start to layer in those additional pieces and have those projects that take us closer to net zero.
Betsy, I'm going to start to pull this to a close, but I want to pitch an idea to you.
Okay.
I really like it when you go into detail. I'm still struggling to pretend that I understand it completely. I get the parameters. I feel others in the audience are with me when we saw the show of hands. What do we all need to take back to our companies to communicate? So what's the message that we should wander away with? What is coming in on change? And I say this because you've leaked out during your presentation projects you've been involved in. I did not get the SAC when the SAC started whatsoever. 4 years later, I realized I wish I'd been involved because it is just such a central pooling of thought. You haven't talked about things like Tin Shed Ventures, which is a really interesting mechanism as well. For us commoners, for us geeks, us nerds, what do we need to go and tell the people in our company? Why should we have a second look at the Future Supplier Initiative?
Yeah, so I think if you're different audiences, so if you're with a brand, I think this is a great time for you to go have a coffee chat with your treasurer or somebody on your finance team to talk about how they are the next CSO. I would just start with that. Like, they're the ones that are going to solve your climate target challenge, and introduce that idea to them and get them excited and start socializing the idea of getting them more involved in understanding financial mechanisms for achieving a climate target. I promise you, they might be like, why are you calling me at first? But they will become your closest friends, and this will become the most interesting part of their job, hands down. I've heard it time and time again from treasurers. They're like, wow, I get to do something that's not like cost cutting or automation or dealing with private equity. Like, thank you. Thank you for letting me bring my values to work. So I would say that would be number one, is start socializing this idea with Treasury and Finance. And then there are forums like with Future Supplier Initiative where you can start introducing them to other treasurers at brands so they can learn more about how these more experienced treasurers got their start in sustainability and how they're bringing sustainability into their own books. So forum for treasurers to become friends on sustainability topics, I'd say, is number two. And then once that happens, then the conversation about like decarbonization is not free and you can't just put it on the backs of your suppliers. Ultimately, you'll pay. That comes naturally after that. And then there might be like the future that we all love, which is when you get that set aside for it. Like, okay, if these projects come along, we want to be able to pounce and support that because we know that this is the one tangible physical way we can actually realistically achieve a 2030 target without hoping that recycling infrastructure and circularity saves our ass, because it just can't right now. It just can't, you know, despite all the amazing initiatives. It's going to be beyond 2030 to get those carbon emission realistically. So
we also need to get you to remember you're in Europe. It's the finance team rather than the treasurer team. But we'll talk about that later.
No, I only work with treasurers in Europe.
Oh, really?
Yeah, it's like the reverse.
So you're in a much bigger scale. Wow. If it's with the treasurers. Right.
The people that hold the purse strings, whatever their names might be, your new best friends. Yeah.
Fantastic. Look, can I ask us all to show our appreciation to Betsy? We're going to have a thank you.
Thank you.